Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can start now. Thanks very much for coming. It's a great attendance this morning here to discuss how the EU can support innovation and job creation in order to support sustainable growth. Also a very important subject in the current political climate. My name's Kevin Schofield. I'm the editor of PoliticsHome.com. Joining me, my illustrious panel today, on my left is MP for Ashford, the Right Honourable Damian Green, former Minister, of course, and Chair of European Mainstream and Vice President of the Tory Reform Group. On my outside right is Edward Bannerman, Advisor to the EU Commission Vice President. Sitting alongside him is Katja, Deputy Director General of the CBI. Beside Damian is John Longworth, Director General of the British Chambers of Commerce, and on the far left is Laura Sands, former MP for South Thanet and Chair of the European Movement. I should tell you at the beginning, this event is being filmed, little camera there, so bear that in mind perhaps when you're speaking. And without any further ado, I'll let the panel and say a few introductory remarks, and then, given there's so many people here and time is limited, I think we'll throw it open to questions. So I'll ask Damian to kick off.
Does the filming mean you want us to sit down?
No, I don't think it matters. No.
Easier for you to see. Right, morning everyone. I'm tremendously impressed that this room is packed full at 9 in the morning of the third day of conference by such fresh-faced, lively-looking. Okay, forget that bit. It's and the basic picture of those of us who believe that Britain's place is in the European Union is that we're stronger, safer and better off inside the EU. And today we're obviously focusing on the better off part of that, the actual creation of jobs and prosperity. And since there are so many of us, I will be very brief. The context in which we operate is, of course, the single market, and it's important to remember that the free trade that we have within the single market, 500 million by and large prosperous people, itself doesn't just help growth, it helps keep prices down. That's what free trade does, because it promotes competition, and therefore as a result consumers benefit as well as businesses themselves. So we've got access to a market of 500 million consumers, and that market takes up just under half our total trade, which is one of the reasons why it would be so wrong-headed to think of moving outside it. And I mean, you'll hear from business representatives as well, but it's worth emphasising that all the serious business organisations in this country, members say that they would prefer, a majority of them would much prefer Britain to be in the EU than to withdraw from it, that it would cause damage to their businesses, and that, to sum it up, Britain and Britain's business would survive outside the EU, but it wouldn't thrive outside the EU. And that seems to me the central issue that politicians and others need to address between now and the referendum, whenever it comes. The EU is Britain's biggest trading partner. There are something like 3 million jobs linked to the exports and trade that we have with the EU, and that trade is worth more than £400 billion a year. Despite the single market consisting of just 7% of the world's population, it generates 20% of global wealth, more than the US or China. And I think that some of the arguments we hear that Britain should concentrate on growing markets like India and China, yes, of course, but I've never understood, I just don't get the logic at all of saying that by making it more difficult to export to Germany and France, you make it easier to export to India and China. Because, of course, it's not a zero-sum game. If you have a successful exporting company, they will probably start with our neighbouring countries and then hopefully move on to export and trade with the rest of the world. But of course, the single market is not enough on its own. Other things need to happen. Europe does need reform. One of the things that would benefit Britain particularly is the creation of a digital single market. We're at the forefront of digital sector innovations, and this country will be one of the big winners when these plans for a digital single market are taken forward. We already have Europe's biggest e-commerce market and the world's second biggest market for audio-visual content. The government estimates that now there are more than 120,000 UK businesses in the digital economy, and obviously we want to grow that in time to come, and there will be huge rewards for that sector from unifying the digital rules across 28 member states. At the moment, of course, it's the classic thing where digital operators face 28 different sets of rules governing e-commerce in each member state. So this is an area ripe for a single market. And the last point I want to make is about jobs, because in the end, as we know, the jobs of the future will depend on the skills that people have, and the EU itself offers a huge amount to young people in terms of helping them get themselves educated and skilled up for the future. It enables our universities to enhance their visibility, their influence and attractiveness. The UK universities are able to contribute £73 billion to the UK economy each year. And I thought it was significant that in this period we are before the referendum, the first sector actually to get out there and say, we're setting up a pro-European, a Keep Britain In campaign, were the universities. They are, of course, forward-looking. One would hope that the best brains are assembled in our universities, and they have got ahead of the game and have already launched their bit of the campaign to keep Britain in the EU. So apart from the direct funding that universities get, they recognise the benefits of being inside Europe, being inside the single market. So this argument will clearly run from now to the referendum, and as I say, this is only one part of the argument, but it is an absolutely essential part of the argument that our jobs and our prosperity are hugely dependent on our membership of the single market of the European Union, and Britain would be mad to turn its back on a group of friendly, prosperous democracies. So I very much hope and expect that the British people will show the common sense we always expect from them and vote to stay in when the referendum comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Damian. Edward, say a few words.
I'll follow Damian's lead and stand up. My name is Edward Bannerman. I'm advisor to Jyrki Katainen, who is the European Commission Vice President responsible for jobs, growth, investment and competitiveness. Prior to taking up that role, he was first Finance Minister and then Prime Minister of Finland. And in that capacity, he worked very closely with Chancellor George Osborne and then Prime Minister Cameron, and I think has many points of common interest and a similar political outlook on many issues. In the new Commission, set out some political priorities, 10 key areas to focus on. And top of that list is the jobs and growth and investment story. So this is an area where my boss in particular is focusing, and where we have a very ambitious agenda we're taking forward under a wider investment plan for Europe. And I want to say just three things about that. The first element of this investment plan, which we often think of as having three pillars to it, is a new legislative proposal called the European Fund for Strategic Investment. We're working very closely with the European Investment Bank, which is the bank of the EU, 28 member state shareholders. And last year the EIB, for example, invested, I think, more than €5 billion in the UK alone. I think you have some material on your seats about that. So we're working with existing financial institutions, using the EU budget in a very different way from traditional grant giving, using it to lend and invest in projects that we think deserve the credit. So that's the new element to the financing of investment. The second element is one that we developed when the Vice President came here to London, to the UK, to discuss the investment plan. He went to the City of London, he met with a lot of people in the financial sector. And they said to him, and the situation now is very different from what it was a few years ago. There's no shortage of liquidity, but what we need is new risk-bearing capacity, and we need a better view of where the investment opportunities are. So we've set up this new project portal, and that is a way of attracting money to worthy projects, and projects can can pitch their case to investors. And of course, the UK, with its strong financial sector, strong financial advisory capacity, is extremely well placed to provide those services for investors. The third element to the investment plan is perhaps the most important one, and that's about really making Europe a better place to invest, changing the outlook, making it deepening and widening the single market, as you already heard, is absolutely fundamental to this. So I think the Vice President is very clear. This is not about public money. This is about creating a space in which private money can invest and where there are new opportunities to do that. We've already heard reference to the digital sector, an extremely important opportunity, in particular for the UK. Only, I think, some 7% of SMEs currently sell cross-border, and that could increase as much as sevenfold if you had single e-commerce rules across the Union. Better regulation, of course, hugely important area, being led by Vice President Timmermans, and a big focus there on getting that right. You may have seen already that this year's work programme for the Commission is 1/5, so 20% of the size of its predecessor. So the Commission is doing much less and trying to focus on getting the big things right, and a big overhaul of how we review and assess legislation. Trade and investment, again, the international agenda is very important, as we've heard. My boss was recently, just last week, in China and Singapore. A lot of interest there in what's happening in Europe. We're negotiating a bilateral investment treaty with China, which will increase investment flows between China and the European Union. We, of course, also are taking forward the TTIP. You may have seen just yesterday the US concluded the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and I think that will now free up an opportunity in Washington to focus more on this transatlantic trade agenda, where we think we can really create the world's largest transatlantic marketplace, and where we can set the norms and standards for the global economy in the 21st century. I was encouraged to see recently a survey of 800 global investors undertaken by Ernst & Young, and they found that actually Europe is the number one destination in terms of attractiveness to investors right now. So that's an encouraging sign that I think around the world people are seeing opportunities now as we come out of the crisis. Yes, we have a long way to go, but we've come out of the crisis and there are opportunities now for investors. And just last week you will have seen the Commissioner for Financial Services, Jonathan Hill, presented the Capital Markets Union Action Plan, a very ambitious proposals to transform the financial landscape, provide new access to finance for small business and create opportunities for those in the financial sector. And just to come right up to date, today in Strasbourg, the Commission will be discussing the internal market strategy, so an umbrella approach to how we can deepen and widen the single market across all areas in the years to come. The UK, with 17 like-minded member states, has written a letter with some very concrete ideas on how we can take that forward, and that will no doubt feature prominently in the discussion today. And I think in the coming weeks we'll be setting out a very ambitious agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Edward. Katja, next.
Thank you very much and good morning everybody. So I wanted to set out the views of CBI members, and CBI members are mainly large firms and then fast growing small and medium sized firms, and they employ around 7 million people in the UK. And a clear majority of our members, though not everybody, believes that it's in Britain's interest to be a member of a reformed EU. And the advantages that they see from EU membership are several of them, but the first one obviously is that it gives UK businesses access to the single market. As you said, Damian, a market of 500 million consumers, 8 times the number of consumers here in the UK, and that leads to more jobs for people here in Britain. Second advantage is that it means that businesses only have to follow one set of rules, and they prefer that to following 28 set of rules. And following one set of rules also then reduces significantly the cost of doing business for our firms here in the UK. The third benefit is freedom of movement. So freedom of movement enables firms here in the UK to get access to the skills that they need to grow and to create more jobs and more wealth. And it, of course, also means that people here in Britain can choose to go and live and work in other EU member states. Another benefit, I think, is we should remember that the UK, because of the membership of the EU, we often act as a springboard to firms who want to come here, to foreign firms who come here to invest in the UK and then do business with the rest of the EU. So part of the reason that firms come here is because of the access to the single market that they get from being here in the UK. Through our membership of the EU, Britain has access to 1/3 of the world's markets by value. So that is another key benefit. And all in all of these advantages mean that we have more jobs here in the UK, we have lower prices in our shops, and we have more choice for consumers. But the EU isn't perfect, and we've talked about that already. So businesses do want to see reforms, and they want to see real and meaningful reforms so that Europe can grow faster and create more jobs. And we've touched on some of those reforms already. But we want to put it kind of in one sentence, we would like to see the EU do more of what it does well and less of what it does badly. So we'd like to see less regulation, less bureaucracy. So let's look at how we can simplify the rules for businesses, especially small businesses, so that they find it easier to grow. There's still quite a long way to go to really break down some of the barriers in services. So let's look at how we can do that and how we can start to make progress on opening up more services across Europe. You've touched already on the digital side, but this is about making it easier to shop online and also to be an online business and use the EU as a springboard for growth. So let's look at how we can support online businesses. I also then think that it is important that we keep spending under control in the EU, and that the spending, and it was great to see the investment package, is focused on how we can support investment and job creation across the whole of the EU. And then finally, but importantly, we want to see the EU have a very, very strong focus on opening up global markets for British businesses. And in particular here, we are strong supporters of the TTIP negotiations and a free trade agreement with the US. CBI has been very supportive of the Prime Minister's agenda to get reforms in the EU, and we ourselves have been doing quite a lot of work with our sister federations across Europe to build up momentum, I guess, for reforms to make Europe more open, outward-looking and competitive. And we think there is real appetite for reform in the EU. Nobody wants a situation like we have now with low growth and, 25% youth unemployment, I think, on average. So we think there is support for a reform agenda, and we've already seen, and you've touched on this, some significant steps towards that reform agenda on things like reducing the number of new initiatives, presenting proposals for a digital single market and the Capital Markets Union. So I think we should keep up the momentum on the reform agenda, but we also shouldn't see reform as something that has a very specific start date and an end date. It's a constant process, and we should always be pushing for the EU to do more on what it does well. The other thing I just wanted to say a couple of words on would be the alternatives to full EU membership. And we have looked at all the alternatives to full EU membership, and our view is that none of them offer the UK a better combination of advantages and disadvantages. So if you look at a country like Norway, not a member, of course, of the EU, but of the EEA, they are still the 10th highest contributor to the EU, and they still have to follow all the EU rules, including freedom of movement of people, but they don't have any say in the setting of those rules at all. So we don't think Norway would be a good option for the UK. And if you look at something like Switzerland, it took Switzerland 9 years to negotiate partial access to the single market, and their agreements don't cover services, which make up 77% of the UK economy. So again, it seems to us that that would not be a good option for the UK. And then, of course, you would have the disruption during the renegotiation period. So if Britain was to come out and then negotiate some form of access arrangement with the EU, that would lead to a period probably of several years of significant disruption. So I think the question for us is not whether Britain would survive outside the EU. Of course we would, but would we prosper? Thank you.
Katja. John Longworth.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming along this morning in a very hot small room. I'm amazed at the number of people here, bearing in mind that this is a subject that, of course, is not allowed to be debated at the Conservative Party conference, at least amongst ministers. I was told yesterday there are, in fact, 20 fringe events on the European Union alone. I have the pleasure and privilege to be speaking at 3 of them. So by the time we get to the end of the day, I'll know what I'm actually about to say. Clearly, a very strong and cogent case has been put by the panel for membership of the European Union. So I often find myself in an extremely uncomfortable position of playing devil's advocate, simply because while our network of businesses undoubtedly would want to remain a member of the European Union, nonetheless, they also want reform. So I'm going to concentrate on setting out what the reform agenda is as we see it. The British Chambers of Commerce isn't proposing to campaign on this issue. What we will do is continue to survey our members right up until the referendum. We do the biggest business surveys in the UK, and we have members of all shapes and sizes and geographies across the UK. We conducted a large European survey only a couple of weeks ago, and I'll be able to inform you in a moment what the outcome of that survey said. At the same time, we're also proposing to try and inform the debate with some of the facts. So first of all, what did our business membership say? Well, almost 2/3 of businesses within our network said, and of course I should really say business leaders, because businesses don't have a vote, only people do. Business leaders said that they would actually vote to stay within the European Union if there were a referendum right now. Having said that, a full half of those businesses said that they would change their minds according to the outcome of the Prime Minister's negotiation, which is a function of the fact that those businesses want reform in the European Union. We also found that the opinion between the businesses on what the impact would be of leaving the European Union was split, in the sense that 40% expect a negative impact if we were to leave on their overall growth prospects, 40% said there would be no impact, and 14% said that leaving would have a positive impact. We also found that 46% of business people considered that the overall impact of leaving the EU would be negative, and 46% said that it would have no impact or a positive impact. So there was a very mixed opinion in the business community about what the implications of the referendum might be if there were a vote to leave. The other interesting fact, I guess, from our survey is that the business community also believe that they are not completely committed to their position. So on either side of the equation, there is a proportion of businesses that are solidly committed to vote one way or the other. More businesses are committed to voting to stay in than to leave, but that is not a firm position. So basically, I think the message is that the business community is divided on the issue, and there's everything to play for, because actually they are prepared to change their minds. Now, I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister a few months ago, an open letter, that set out what the business community believe the Prime Minister should be negotiating on, in the absence of any indication from him about what he is negotiating on. And that letter set out a number of things that our network feel are important to them. And this survey actually reinforced that the letter was in fact still top of mind for businesses. The number one issue for businesses is to sort out the relationship between the European Union and the Eurozone. There are a number of member states who are not in the Eurozone at the moment, as you're probably aware. Some member states have indicated that they are not going to join the Eurozone, the UK being one of them. The Eurozone is capable of caucusing in votes within the European Union, and the risk and danger for the UK is, if that were to happen, then in the future, UK may be damaged both politically and economically, and certainly marginalised. So sorting out the relationship between the Eurozone and the non-Eurozone members of the European Union is an important matter if we're actually to have good economic prospects. That is number one on the list, and of course the Prime Minister himself has said that that is the number one on his list as well. The second area that businesses are particularly concerned about is the move to ever closer union. They say that in fact the move to ever closer union is not something that they would desire. They're extremely interested in making the single market work better. In particular, of course, the UK is largely a service sector economy. About 10% of UK GDP is manufacturing. So having a single market in services is extremely important to UK business and economic prospects. At the moment, there is no single market in services within the EU to speak of, other than in the area of wholesale banking. We've heard, of course, about the digital proposals, which would be a service sector proposal that would help to create a single market in digital, which, of course, our businesses would support. But actually pushing further on the single market in services is very important. Having visited in the last few months both the Secretariat Generals and Director Generals of Internal Markets and Trade in Brussels, it's clear to me that at the moment there is no desire at all, no prospect of a single market in services within the EU. The single market in goods is itself at risk, and this is something we should be concerned about and other member states should be equally concerned about. I'm told by the Internal Market Director General that he is receiving 3 notifications a day at the moment of laws being introduced by member states which effectively block the free movement of goods, so over 1,000 a year. The Internal Market Directorate General is unable to do anything about this other than issue letters of censure, which of course they cannot do in every case. And despite having asked member states to nominate enforcement bodies for the single market, no member state, including the UK, has been prepared to do so. So the single market in goods is to some extent itself unravelling, and this should be a concern both to the UK and other member states who actually are interested in free trade. So that's another area that our membership are concerned about and wish to do something about. The regulatory burdens of the European Union, of course, are a fourth area of concern, and certainly our membership want to see regulation limited to matters that relate directly to trade rather than matters that are of other consequence. The BCC used to keep a tracker, actually until 2010, called the Burdens Barometer, with the list of legislation that the EU produce, and that was costed at the time to add up to £88 billion a year of cost to the UK business community. We actually stopped producing it in 2010, before my time in fact, because we'd reached the ridiculous figure of 88 billion and nobody was listening. Since then, of course, we've had a number of directives introduced that have been certainly very costly for the UK. I think that our community believe that going forward we don't want to see increasing regulatory burdens. And finally, we want a sensible approach to immigration. We have the worst of all worlds, you could argue, at the moment, in the sense that we have a cap on immigration from outside the European Union in order to control overall immigration numbers, which actually prevents businesses accessing the skills that they might want from around the world. Important and vital skills for the UK business community. It delays the coming into the UK of those people. Similarly, of course, education is a service sector export in its own right, and therefore students are very important too. But at the same time, there's no discrimination in terms of who comes in from within the EU. And that can be problematic in relation to downward pressure on wages and, of course, a disincentive to investment in productivity improvements. So we have a very mixed up picture on immigration at the moment. It's a very difficult subject to tackle within the EU context, but the network want it to be addressed in some way or other. So those are the sort of things that our business community think, and I hope that helps to inform the debate. Thank you.